welcome to another Hot Topic where we discuss the issues affecting East Yorkshire and Northern Lincolnshire. Funding for mental health facilities is under pressure nationally and especially in North East Lincolnshire. Navigo, which provides adult mental health treatment for the county, see more and more people experiencing mental health problems and accessing their services. However, people with mental health problems are now going out of area due to a lack of facilities in North East Lincolnshire. I'll be discussing this with my guest tonight, Kevin Bond, Chief Executive of Navigo. Kevin, welcome. Thank you very much for coming in. First of all, before we get to the nitty-gritty locally, let's try to define some terms a little bit. What is mental illness, mental dis-ease, mental disease?
Oh, so it's such a difficult one, isn't it? And it does, you're very right, cover a lot and is a very flexible concept. All sorts of people, you know, we do this talk, don't we? 1 in 4 people will have a mental health problem and all this. Actually, all of us will have mental health problems. And I guess the issue is those of us who require much more formal support. So it may be things like depression, and that can happen at a lot of different levels. All of us will have felt some level of depression. Most of us, fortunately, will have never felt the depths of depression.
But to stay with depression, which I know is one of the more mild things that your organisation deals with, but is depression... Is that really a medical condition? We've all been unhappy, we've all been sad, and we all know we will be again. Where does that cross the line and become a medical condition rather than a perfectly legitimate and even healthy emotion?
I don't think, I mean, most of us will never have suffered the kind of depression that some people we see will suffer. It's possible to get to a point where you just have one reverberating thought in your head and you would get pressure sores if you weren't moved, and you wouldn't eat or drink and would actually quite literally die of a broken heart. So there are levels and depths of depression which hopefully most of us can only kind of understand intellectually, but one have experienced, which are, you know, really terrible. Equally, most of us will suffer at least one episode of mild or moderate depression. And even that, without the right support mechanisms, sometimes it's the right time in your life that you can cope, and other times you might not have the right support mechanisms. You know, you might require a few pointers, perhaps a bit of cognitive work, those kind of things. But it is very common, yes, depression is common at varying levels. Yeah.
I interrupted you just to ask you about that, but the other sort of definitions of mental illness. I mean, how does one diagnose, as it were? How does one define the disease, and how does one diagnose?
There is a whole book called the ICD-10 codes which diagnose it, and frankly it is so full of different disorders that one could interpret many different things. I think probably need to think about how much help does a person require, what can be done to help somebody. You know, is this about supporting someone totally? Is it about giving people you know, transient support? Is this something that will be going on? The people we deal with, some people come to us very briefly and go away and never come back again. Some people come to us cyclically, and some people require our support for most of their lives, in terms of some people who are perhaps hearing voices. You know, we used to refer to schizophrenia a lot. People who hear voices and maybe feel their thoughts are being tampered with, or most painfully, actually, one of the symptoms is a thing called thought broadcasting, where you feel that your thoughts can be heard by other people. Now, it doesn't take much to imagine how painful that might be as a kind of feeling. So, you know, many people might require much more intervention from us and constant kind of supervision to help to get on with their lives. So we do a huge amount of stuff around employment and vocation to try and help people have a life.
Well, I know you're not a doctor, and so I don't want to sort of unfairly ask you clinical questions, but the treatment for mental health, one immediately thinks of a talking cure, you know, the psychoanalysis and all the other ways, sitting down with a psychiatrist or a psychoanalyst of some sort, and I suppose the other route is drugs.
No, a whole host of different things now. Even talking therapies as such will divide up into numerous different things. I will do one particular thing, other people do other stuff. You'll hear the talk of cognitive therapies quite a lot. There's also dialectical behavioural therapy, DBT, you hear talked about, mentalisation, all sorts of other things. We talk a lot at the moment about living in the moment, you know, like the idea of trying to feel now, you know, actually think about and feel now.
Carpe diem.
Yes, indeed.
I know how you like your Latin.
Today.
I know how you like your Latin.
I do. Well, only that first do no harm, as you know. Yeah, and then there's drugs, and, you know, some of that can be quite helpful. We do a thing, we are possibly the only place in the world, I think, that do directed what's called transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's We do an EEG and target this. Our service users asked us years ago to look into this and come away from treatments like ECT as much as we could. And we've now got that NICE approved. So there are other treatments.
That's approved by that NICE is the authority.
Yeah, NICE is the authority for approving clinical treatments.
So what's that? That sounds, I think I have visions of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, an electric shock
TMS is transcranial magnetic stimulation. It is a very small magnetic stimulation to the right place in your brain, if you like. The unique thing we do is we take an EEG so you can see your brain waves and then you can target it in the right place. And we've got a professor and a research doctor working on that. And we did it for all the right reasons, actually. I don't get excited about clinical things, but it was because service users asked us to use less ECT and think about how that was working. And in fairness, in mental health services, it was, I think, probably certainly at the time, overused. And so we agreed a protocol where we'd only use it where people requested it, or whether if it was urgent or an emergency treatment, we would use it, and we would seek other alternatives, and this is where we came upon TMS.
Can I just, one more sort of this definition thing. I mean, is it rude to use the word madness to describe somebody as mad?
I guess, I mean, it's used colloquially, isn't it? It's also used, it's used for kind of moments of irrational behaviour, I guess.
Well, I was told off using the word gaga when we were talking about dementia a few weeks ago. So I just thought it was a less harsh word than demented. But just sort of thinking that an emotional disturbance that might in old literature have been described as madness, is that different from a mental illness?
I think we're in the same territory there, aren't we? I mean, I think we are talking about issues. And I think you raise an important concept there, because we're talking about how do people feel about the way they are labelled and what does it do to them. So the word schizophrenia, for instance, the moment you have that label, you are already doomed to have some difficulties. People find it a very frightening word. It does sound like something will be terribly wrong with you, and yet many people may have one episode and recover, and a lot of people do, in fact, manage this difficulty quite well and get on with their lives, with support often. But, you know, it's a very emotive term, isn't it? So how do we label people? How do we talk about people? You know, we used to use horrible terms like cretin, didn't we, and stuff like that, and these were actually terms for cretinitis, which was a medical syndrome. So you know, we need to think really carefully about how we use words and how people feel about themselves.
So the words take on a subjective value that doesn't represent their objective meaning, don't they?
They will become, almost all of them become very negative, don't they? At some point in time they become slang or used in abuse. And for me, one of the biggest issues for people with mental health problems, if you listen carefully and think about this carefully, is not the illness itself, it's the way other people treat you. So if you're diagnosed, for instance, with schizophrenia and you're quite young, the chances of you finding a job and working for any length of time is very limited, and all sorts of other things become limited. There's almost an expectation that you will not be able to contribute fully. That's not a fair expectation nor a reasonable one. With the word schizophrenia, many people relate dangerousness, and actually that's unfair as well and doesn't stack up. Most people, when they're ill, actually want to be on their own and away from other people. So unless they're very floridly ill, then that tends not to happen. So there are many terms and many misunderstandings about mental health that actually the stigma itself causes more problems than the illness in many respects.
Well, I want to, the harm that mental health causes is it's not, you're not, apart from that broken heart and deep depression, I mean, the worst thing I suppose that can happen is suicide, or even worse than that, perhaps taking other people's lives as well, but that's the absolute extreme. Can there not be, again, we were talking about dementia a few weeks ago, can there not be a state where that mental illness, as it were, is subjectively experienced by the sufferer as a perfectly pleasant experience?
Occasionally. I mean, there are things like mania that at its early stages is a state of sort of with some euphoria in it and some real optimism and real sense. It then goes well beyond that and becomes unmanageable, and you know, people have numerous thoughts in their head all at once and becomes very, very uncomfortable, and you can't live a normal life and other people can't keep up with you. So that becomes a problem. I mean, to some extent we all are wired differently, and to some extent we all are different and need to do different things to cope with different things. So where does this line begin has always been an interesting kind of discussion.
It's not the mental illness that needs defining, it's the word sanity that needs defining.
And it is something, well, it's also something about how people cope. There is no normal as such. You know, we're all eccentric in some ways. how do people cope? How do they get on with their lives, and how do they get on with the rest of the world around them? How do they feel about themselves? Because actually, as we speak, and this is all about how people feel about people with mental health problems. If you have a serious mental health problem, you're going to die 20 years younger than the rest of the population. And you're not going to die of your mental health problem. You're going to die of poor physical health and preventable illnesses and neglect, actually, often.
Kevin, we'll talk about more about that and more about perceptions of the condition in a moment. We must break there. Okay. Please join me again after the break and we'll continue talking about mental health. Welcome back. I'm still with Kevin Bond, Chief Executive of Navigo, responsible for the mental health of North East Lincolnshire. Kevin, we attempted to work out what on earth we're talking about here. What do you do about it? What is Navigo?
Navigo is a social enterprise that uniquely was created to involve both its staff and people who use the services and carers, and people who genuinely have an interest in mental health in the actual services locally. I think in many respects, I worked for the health service for many, many years, and I really believe in the ethic of the health service, and Navigo is a completely not-for-profit organisation. Anything we do gets invested back in the local community.
It's still separated from the NHS, though, isn't it?
It is.
There was a time when the NHS would look after mental health.
We are a social enterprise. We are the same staff we were before when we were part of the NHS in many respects, but what we are is different, lighter on our feet, less bureaucracy. I think, on a personal view, I think the NHS has lost its way somewhat. There's a lot of talk of, metrics and all these kind of things.
We'll come on to the NHS in a moment, but Navigo, it's based in Grimsby. Yep. How many people are there working there?
There's about 550 of us.
Really? Big organisation.
Yeah. And our membership is about 750, 800 at the moment, and that is equal voting rights, staff and people who use the service and carers. So all the people in the membership have equal voting rights.
So when you say members, you mean all the people who work for you, yes, all the patients as well, all the people you help?
Anyone who joins our membership will then get equal voting rights. So, and these are very real voting rights, because often people think, oh yes, voting rights, no doubt they vote on very unimportant things. Actually, you can vote on me every 3 to 4 years and whether I should stay in my post. If I don't account to the membership, who do I account to actually? If it's not to people we serve, who is it? And certainly working in the health service, that didn't exist, that direct accountability. People vote on, if we make a surplus, we put 100,000 back each year, and people suggest the schemes, and then we vote on the schemes and we fund the most popular of those schemes, and we work it into a real thing. So we've provided houses as an employment scheme and done them up so people can get skills, and then rented them to vulnerable people. We've provided a roving group room, if you like, a bus that folds out into a nice room so we can get to more isolated areas.
You go out into rural Lincolnshire as well as North East Lincolnshire as well?
North East Lincolnshire is our catchment mostly, although we do some work for NHS England specialist eating disorders. We also do supervision and teaching nationally for some big mental health trusts. So we supervise a thing called Respect, which is unashamedly campaigning for better treatment in terms of managing volatile behaviours, if you like. So we're very keen on prevention, and we think the national debate is about face-down holding. Our view is there should be no face-down holding. That's barbaric and of another time. So
there's a self-defence element there sometimes, though, I would imagine.
It's not necessary, to be honest, not necessary. Never used it anywhere, never intend to use it. In my career, our version is approved by people who use our service, and, it is possible to hold people face up. Oh. It's less undignified. Not that you don't have to hold people sometimes, we will lose our temper. The idea should be that you can facilitate people through that rather than, kind of just control people. We use no pain in those techniques. Some mental health, they use pain to control people. That can't be right in this day.
That sounds barbaric. That's the 19th century.
It does to me as well.
How do people, if they are worried that there's something wrong with their mental health, how do they become part of your organisation? You notice you use the phrase members rather than patients, so I'll follow that example.
We tend to, again, it's about labels, isn't it? A patient is a kind of term that suggests that somebody will need to be helped by somebody else and will be in the control of somebody else. technically people who come to us in our units, clearly they're registered as hospitals, would be patients, but to constantly remind people of this is not always a helpful thing. I tend to do with our doctors. People need to know you're a doctor once for credibility's sake, after which they need to meet you on a much more human level. Likewise, myself and any of our other staff, qualified staff, unqualified staff, it's about relationships. When we do our work well, it's about relationships.
But how do they come to you? You go to your GP? Are people referred
They
from
come
hospitals?
from numerous places. People can walk direct off the streets into what are called IAP, increasing access to psychological treatments. This is common mental health problems, you and I, mild depression, anxiety, maybe phobias, that kind of thing. Walk straight off the street, through the GP referrals. In crisis, people come straight to our units, or they can come through community teams, all sorts of others. We're also very flexible. The last person I spent some time doing sessions with actually came to me via me doing a presentation and a husband approaching me and saying, and my wife is still very depressed after the death of our son.
How many people do you help a year?
You put me right on the spot there. I think we have about, off the top of my head, I want to say 9,000 or so contacts. So it's a very significant number of people, and it's 7% more every year.
And we'll come again onto that as well. But and how do you know when you've won? How do you know when you've succeeded with each of those 9,000 people? What does victory look like? What does success look like?
Success would look different for each different person. I guess that in many respects, it's how can somebody be helped to get on with their lives and be helped to feel okay about what's going on with them, and how can we help people set a different rhythm if they need to their lives and the different things. So we put a lot into employment. Chooks is our local service. It does all the employment, does shops, runs the local park. We run a garden centre on the edge of town. This is all about helping people get skills and feel different about themselves and get contact and gain confidence and meet other people and get qualifications. I don't know, the first time you got a qualification, how do you feel about yourself? Because many of the people that we were dealing with long-term mental health problems had no qualifications, and therefore, maybe weren't able to different skills or feel good about that kind of thing. Yeah.
Just I must ask, where does the name Navigo come from?
And just about every name that we have is very meaningful. So Chooks is all about William Chooke, and William Chooke was a wonderful reformer. When the Victorians were chaining people to the wall, William Chooke said, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you let them do some work and a little bit of this and that? And if you treat people better, maybe they behave well. So he was a wonderful man ahead of his time. Harrison House, one of our acute facilities, is named after John Harrison, the guy who did Longitude.
Local hero here.
You know
yes.
where you are in the world and those kind of things. Navigo was, we sat one afternoon trying to think of a name, and after about 2 hours we were talking about navigation and going forward in the world and knowing where you were in the world, and we ended up just saying, oh, that's good enough, it'll have to do.
Okay.
It'll have to do.
Fair enough. What does the future look like?
The future is difficult at the moment. I think the future for Navigo is wonderful. In terms of, we don't get everything right, of course we don't, but the mental health services here, by anyone's measure, are far, far better than the average. I'm not a great believer in targets, but if they all point in the same direction, you have something to do there. People's own reports of how they feel about the service are better than most services. So that part of the service, I think we head in the right direction, and the more we listen to people who use our services, the better we get at it, and the better we get at that, the better we will get. So the membership, wonderful thing, helps us really think about how people experience the service. Our problems as we stand at present are funding, yeah.
And that your sources of money are mostly from, and this is where we might start getting to the nitty-gritty of the money here a bit, the local clinical commissioning group, which is specifically for North East Lincolnshire. Yes. How much money do they give you?
It's something in the again in the region of something like 17 million for the total contract for mental health.
Do you have any other sources of income?
We do. We get some from, the unique thing we can do as a social enterprise is we get some from training, we get some from shops and premises we run, we get some from specialist work we do for NHS England on eating disorders. So we actually subsidise the local service with money we earn as well.
I know the answer to this question because I've asked it of many people in your position, and it's always the same. Is it enough?
No, it's not. But what the issue with us is actually about fairness. And so the issue nationally is about fairness. Mental health services are funded less for the prevalence of the, I don't like the word illness, but for the prevalence of the illness, mental health issues, they are funded less than any other kind of illness group, if you like, given the amount of, the psychiatrists describe it as disease burden. I really don't like these as phrases. Yeah. So it's a parity of esteem for the disease burden. This is not good language. But the idea is how much of this illness exists and what does it need against how much of the funding. And mental health is way down underneath what it needs to be. Now that's true nationally, and the average spend is 12.7. If
the average spend of local commissioning groups
of their total budgets is 12.7%.
Yep.
Of our local commissioning group, well, if you believe the CCG's figures, it's 11.7. So theirs is a full 1% less. That's something over £2 million, and that's their figures.
Yep.
The national published figures say that we get 9.3%. I believe they have an explanation for that.
Kevin, we will go into those figures in a little bit more detail and try to work out where the difference in the disparity in the interpretation of the figures
However
is.
you look at it, we are funded less than
but also we'll talk about the demand for those resources as well. Sorry, Kevin, I must stop there for a second. Come back in a moment and we'll be talking about how we pay for mental health in North East Lincolnshire. Welcome back. I'm still with Kevin Bond, the Chief Executive of Navigo, responsible for mental health here in North East Lincolnshire. Kevin, we were just starting to talk about the horrible subject of money there. The Clinical Commissioning Group for North East Lincolnshire spends on mental health, i.e. on you, about 9.3% of its budget?
Well, those are the figures that are published nationally. I believe the Clinical Commissioning Group is saying that we're including things like spend on social care as well. So their extrapolation is they spend, I think, 11.7. But however you argue this, because we could just talk about figures all day, couldn't we?
Well, we're going to have to spend a little time doing that.
But however you argue it, that's 1% less than the national average and considerably less than what they call our deprivation decile, so what our deprivation group is.
National average is 12.7% of health budget spent on mental health. Deprivation decile, that means what? That because there's a certain amount of deprivation, this is a poor part of the country, that there's more likelihood to be mental problems.
More burden in terms of mental health problems, yeah. But to me, that's all a little bit interesting to me and you and to accountants, but to the local public, this means actually that even by the CCG's own admission, they spend about 2.2 million less on mental health service than the average. And what Navigo suggests, because we do generate some of our own money, is that we just need about half of that to provide an excellent, by other people's ratings, service. So actually we're cheaper and we're sustainable for less money, because at present we're running the service for £4.5 million less each year than we were when the CCG took over, and that was 5 years ago. And yeah, that's a lot of money, £4.5 million.
And nevertheless, you're still winning awards. I just got from your own press release, so it's slightly blowing your trumpet for you. But you got the Guardian Public Service Award, the Baxendale Award, Government Office Award, Sunday Times, and the Health Service Journals have all given you awards for the outstanding nature of your work.
We have, and we've won other awards. I suppose the thing about that is it always feels a bit, I don't know, I'm always a little bit, feels a little bit self-effacing about those. But yes, they are, and they're nice accolades to have, and it tells you how hard our community work to provide good service.
If you have the resources sufficient to be so outstanding as to win these awards, why do you need more money?
I think in the last 2 years we've actually registered a loss of over 650,000, so we're about to do that again. Number one, that means even if we could sustain it, it makes it very difficult to borrow money against the future and provide update units and stuff like that. Number two, clearly that can't sustain, which means as we speak at present, we are subsidising the local service by over 1.1 million. We're still overspending by about 650,000. and the CCG would wish to cut that further, clearly we can't function like that. So something's going to have to stop happening, or we are going to have at least a slightly fairer share of the budget.
Well, the CCG isn't here, so it's a bit unfair not to not mention the fact that they would look at those figures differently. They'd say, in fact they have said that Netmego gets an increase of £1 million over the last 2 years. But that's insufficient, I take it.
Yeah. Well, no, in real terms, many of these figures, the sad thing about bandying the figures, and a real shame that the CCG wouldn't be here today to talk about this.
To be fair to them, I don't think we got in touch with them with this issue.
Well, okay, but our view of the world, and it is a perfectly simple one, is that in real terms we are running the services now for £4.5 million, and we can show the figures for that, less than we were, and 7% more people every year coming in. And what's clearly true is some of the investments that the CCG suggests they're making are money that was already spent, or actually out of area treatments. We look after out of area treatments. Most mental health trusts do not. It's a CCG responsibility, and it's overspending. People who are having to go out of area, some because of CCG's decisions, and yet we are the ones who have looked after the money for that.
By its own admission, the CCG, even on its figures, is spending 1% less than the national average, and still spending even less than that against what you would suggest because of the deprivation decile. Why? What? You get into their heads. Tell me what on earth they're thinking. Why are they spending less on North East Lincolnshire's mental health than any other part of the country would wish to spend on theirs?
That might be any combination of reasons, mightn't it? Supposing it is a really difficult one, I think to some degree, why is mental health nationally badly provisioned? I do think there is stigma, and I do think there is an issue.
But why is North East Lincolnshire even worsely, if that word exists, even worse provisioned than the rest of the country? Because we'll come on to the national attitudes to mental health and to money in a moment, if we may. But why is North East Lincolnshire? Why do we prioritise mental health less than other parts of the country?
I suspect we have coped with underfunding for some time. We've raised money. We've covered those difficulties for some time. Although we've talked about them, I don't think that's been heard. And now we're in a real crisis and a real difficulty. It brings us to the situation we're in now. I suspect we have, to some degree, inadvertently covered that by earning money from the public and other kind of things and reinvesting it in the local community by winning awards and stuff. So it sounds like things are going along very, very well, doesn't it?
Made a rod for your own back by succeeding.
Yeah, we may have made a rod for our own back by succeeding, and that's a real shame. I was actually asked once, I won't say who by, but what would an average service cost? Which is a depressing comment, isn't it? Is something of an aspiration lack, isn't it?
Well, every pound that's given to you is a pound that's taken out of the pockets of some other doctors treating some other bits of us that can go wrong, I suppose. So there is a.
It is, except in that we already provide an excellent service for under the average, and that's our clear message. We don't even want the average. We actually just want a little bit more to make sure we can carry on running the services that the public here have come to expect, and rightly so. In my view.
One of the problems that all the health service mental facilities, as it were, are looking at the moment is sending people away when they need beds, when they need to be looked after, is that they find themselves having to go to far distant parts of the country. We're all very aware of the case of Sally Burke, who's campaigning in Hull at the moment, and her daughter, who's clearly in great mental distress, has been sent now. It was to Stafford, now it's only to Sheffield, but that's still a long way to go to be with your family and to be with your distressed daughter. How big a problem is that?
It's becoming a greater problem, I understand, nationally, and it's becoming a problem here with older people. I suppose there's two different things here. One is if someone needs something highly specialist that requires, real kind of intensity, that might require a group of professionals who are going to be very hard to find, then you might have to expect to travel. So if I don't know what the physical equivalent is these days, but if I need, I don't know, open heart surgery or something, I might need to travel a little way to get the best of that, and it might not be my GP surgery. Okay, that's fine. I'm comfortable with that. I think when we're talking about vulnerable groups of people, you know, the idea is it should be as close to home as possible. Now, if you're talking about young people, as in that instance, you know, that should be really close to the person's
You want to be
home,
close to
because
mum,
they've got to
don't
be close
you?
to their community, their family and other people. I think that's really essential. If you're talking about older people at the point of crisis and memory loss and stuff like that, they really shouldn't be going out of area. This is something that is, yeah, abhorrent, to be honest. It should be enough facility locally to do that. Very distressing for people in a time of that kind of need to be away from their family. And if they're older again, their families are likely to be older, and travel becomes much more of a difficulty. So these are, I think it's the mark of society how it treats its most vulnerable people, you know, how civilised we are, and I sometimes think we're getting this wrong now.
Well, I wonder why. I mean, perfectly logical. If you need a particular specialist and that particular specialism is best practiced in another part of the country, that's where you go.
Yeah.
But a lot of these people are having to go a long way from home because there simply aren't the beds or the facilities close to home. But by definition, that means there are spare beds, facilities in excess, a surplus in some other part of the country. Why are not the beds? I mean, I'm not supposed to want the beds to be mobile.
This is the topsy-turvy way that the health service runs these days. There's a touching faith in contracts and people doing things by contracts. You can't express care by a contract. It just doesn't work like that. And the problem for us is here. We have eating disorder beds available here for over 17-year-olds. NHS England, it is actually, that buy these specialist services because they believe they have enough beds in the country as a whole. They are prepared to send people very long distances rather than put them locally. Again, you know, this feels for this group of people who are so very, very ill and have a massive mortality rate in terms of eating disorders, a very risky thing to have in terms of a mental health problem, and need really close-up care. To be sending them miles feels to be a very unpleasant and unnecessary thing to do. So, you know, there's something wrong with that whole contracting regime.
And yet you have to have some sort of contract because you know, all this has been bought with other people's money.
Of course, it's been bought with yours and my money, and I'm very respectful of that. But equally, again, I don't mind waiting perhaps a day longer to see my GP. I can take that. I would rather older people didn't go out of area here locally. I don't mind waiting a day longer to see my GP, so long as very vulnerable people with eating disorders are getting good care.
Aren't starving to death.
Yeah, it feels to me that, you know, we need to get that priority.
Kevin,
right.
I'll just have to stop you there one final time for a quick break. Please join us again after this break. Welcome back. I'm still with Kevin Bond of Navigo, talking about mental health and how we pay for the resources to look after it. On the 11th of January, the Prime Minister made an announcement, and he did use this frame, parity of esteem,
He did,
I'm afraid,
yes.
That you dislike, that saying that mental health should be getting much more money and pledging to spend another £1 billion on mental health. First time I can remember a Prime Minister in a speech has ever addressed the subject of mental health. Is this a good thing?
Yeah. I mean, I like the concept of parity of esteem. It's just a phrase that seems so remote from normal people. But there you are. It's a military term, I understand. So it's about parity of esteem between bombing and on-the-ground tanks and stuff, which doesn't fit health services.
Not very well, no.
Yes, it is. It's encouraging that he's talking about it. I suspect that, you know, actually funding of mental health has gone down. We know that's true. We know it was in the 13% and it went nationally to 12.7%. So we know it's gone down. So is this just filling back the hole that actually was taken out? But yeah, it's encouraging that there is some conversation about these issues.
Well, I think the hole the hole that it's trying to fill is much bigger than that billion, isn't it? Because in the last 5 years, demand for mental health,
Yes,
this is nationally, demand for mental health has gone up by 20%, and the spending on it has gone down by 8% in the 5 years. This is for the whole country.
So, yeah, I'm being charitable.
Nothing wrong with that.
Nowhere near enough. Nowhere near enough. And warm words, let's hope actions follow. The problem with this is sometimes that money is talked about on a national level, never actually reaches local services in any cogent way. So, and the NHS has a huge bureaucracy now, and that kind of, it's like a sieve, you know, some of that money catches in that sieve before it disappears through the system. So let's see where that goes. You know, time will tell about that. It is focused more on specific groups of people, and it's also focused on specific models, and some of those may not be the most up-to-date ways of doing things. So there is that slight caveat to that.
There is. It's quite specifically particular mental problems that it's aimed at. It's for healthcare for new mothers.
Yep.
Are they particularly prone to mental? I know postnatal depression and all that.
Good and important thing to do, yes, absolutely, and you know, there is a need there, there's no doubt about that.
Special services to help teenagers with eating disorders, and you've already mentioned how dangerous they are.
Hugely important.
I think more people die of eating disorders than die of suicide, don't they?
They do, yeah.
As a condition. But also a lot more money to go for effective alternatives to hospital to help teenagers. And to keep people out of hospitals.
Good stuff there, and there's also some investment on liaison with hospitals, and that's why I say, is this the most up-to-date model? Because some models are a bit different about how general hospitals are supported. I don't want, for instance, people with mental health problems queue in an A&E. It's not the right environment. It's not the right environment if you're really distressed. We need to provide better environments for that kind of thing. So providing liaison, good thing. Maybe there's a better way of diverting people out of those kind of environments and trying not to have them locally. We're reasonably successful at not having large numbers of people in A&E. We tend to do it on different sites and try to keep out of high-stress environments.
This is an extra billion, which is a significant materiality. As Ronald Reagan said, a billion here, a billion there, it soon adds up to real money.
Indeed.
But there might be a lot of people looking at the National Health Service now and its budget and thinking, well, if we've got that extra billion, that's what we give to the junior doctors who are now occasionally striking. That billion would be better spent making sure that the junior doctors are happy and not tired and willing to stay.
You've got to wonder, haven't you, about the whole of the health service at present. You have to wonder about how well funded it is, but actually also how well run is the health service as we speak. And I dearly love the health service. I worked in it for many years myself, not exclusively, but for most of my career in the health service. It does feel like we've got a problem with leadership at present. We're talking business terms, we're talking ugly language, we're talking things that don't include people, and then we have the Francis inquiry, lack of compassion, all those kind of things.
This is old people being very badly, horribly treated in
far
homes.
Too much time now talking about strategies and metrics and things that distance people from people. I think we need to get the word people back in there. I sat in a meeting myself a few times where I've counted the word people used nil times, and you know, to add one to that score usually gets people to say, yeah, that's quite important as well. It really matters that all of our conversations focus around people who receive the services. That's the whole point of having accountants to do finance and anything else. And I suggest that's why we are top scorers in staff surveys as well, because our finance people
That's you as Navigo, not as the NHS, Navigo.
And we meet people, our finance people will meet people who have mental health problems every day, and so will our workforce people, and so will I and everyone else. And you know, that matters, because we know who we work for.
Well, that's an ethos that's very admirable, and I don't think it's unique to Navigo. I certainly hope it's not.
No,
that you can find that elsewhere in the country. As you say, the management of the NHS is permanently always going to be under criticism, because I can't remember a time when it's ever been thought of as adequate. But I just want to ask about the resourcing, the money. NHS gets between 16 and 19% of GDP every year. That's it's almost 90 pence out of every fiver we spend on the NHS. Is there ever going to be a number that's enough?
That's fascinating, because I was reading this morning that we're lower than the European average by a mile as well. So it's all about averages, isn't it? And what gives you decent healthcare? How well do you value healthcare? For me, health and education are things that all of our population should have an equal right to, and all of our population should have good shares of. What you do with that afterwards is your business. But actually, let's get us to a point where we're a healthy, reasonably educated population, and then, okay, we can do so much more with our lives. If we have a chronically unhealthy population and a chronically stretched health service, actually it pays off. It's inefficient and pays off in other places, doesn't it? So it's probably not a saving, is it?
And everybody's just more unhappy.
Yes, indeed. We don't score well on happiness scores in this country either, do we? So,
well, we gave that up. That idea didn't really work, did it?
It's not an easy measure, but we probably gave it up because we didn't score well on it, did we?
Well, it's not in an English person's nature to discuss such things anyway, is it? An enormously intrusive question. I want to just get back to this idea of, you mentioned education, and perhaps half the problem with mental health aspects is that other people's reaction to mental health is ignorant.
It is. The biggest problem, I think, is not the illness, but the way people are treated following the illness, and the way society feels about mental health problems. And we've come away. We are talking about things, and locally here in North East Lincs, I want to be very clear. The population here have massively changed, and the local media and various other things on, kind of projects. Tukes has been a real, ice melter on that with public cafes and the local park and all that. And I'm, planning permission is easier to come by now. At first it was awful process, and there were clear worries in that process that didn't need to be there.
Well, this is for building new facilities.
Indeed, for reasonable facilities in public and stuff. And I'm deeply grateful to the local population, because I think there has been much of a change in the way people think about mental health, but still there's a long way to go here, isn't there?
What's caused that change? Because I remember back in, we used to use horrible words back when I was a kid in the 1970s, and yet I don't think I was particularly malicious then. I was probably extremely ignorant, but then you are when you're 7. So I've changed that, but what's changed in the culture? What's changed in society?
A lot of it is about ignorance, but we're beginning to talk a bit about it. Here's your difference, and we're beginning to be honest about it. People are beginning to say, look, hey, I have had a mental health problem. Some of my family's had a mental health problem. It was like this. It was awful, and let's understand what went on there. I think there's a lot of talk that didn't take place. It used to be a kind of under the carpet kind of thing, didn't it? That's good, that's nice. I think the other thing for us, and our service really concentrates heavily, is a thing called valued roles. If people aren't seen as having value, then people will treat them badly, won't they? So for us, it's all about what does life look like in a healthy way for you? Are you seeing, you're an interviewer on a television programme, this is accorded some value. We say, oh, that's interesting, and we can have a conversation.
I wouldn't take that for granted.
I wouldn't take it for granted, but it has some value, and we can talk about this, and it's got some fascination about it. I'm a chief executive, or I was a director of mental health or whatever. We could, oh, that's interesting. You try to avoid that at parties. It doesn't do your social life much good, but there's something to talk about there. Part of what we do is what we are, whether we like it or not. If you have no job and you've had a mental health problem and you didn't get any qualifications at school and all these kind of things, it begins to limit the way other people will see you. So what we try and do is get people new skills, new opportunities and new ways to function, because virtually everyone has real talents. It's a question of finding which. So it's about the way life carries on, not the illness. What will you do after the illness or during the rest of your life?
So it's a question of putting together the knowledge with the underlying talent.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to have time to get onto the rather interesting subject of the correlation between mental illness and genius. Which might be something for another programme. Thank you so much for coming, and absolutely enlightening. Please join me again for Hot Topic next week. Get in touch through Twitter or the Facebook, and I will see you again next Monday. For now, goodbye.